Hi, hello, people. I just finished my first quarter at Stanford University, and one of the classes I took was a seminar called Environmental Justice and Anthropology. I very much enjoyed this class. It was lots of reading, writing, and reflecting. Definitely structured a lot more loosely than my high school classes were, but I learned a lot. Less so in terms of facts and testable knowledge, but more in the sense of new ways of thinking and new lenses of approaching familiar issues. So, what is anthropology? The dictionary definition is the study of human beings and their ancestors through time and space, and in relation to physical character, environmental and social relations, and culture. Which is honestly pretty nebulous. Like, I talked to a bunch of anthropology majors in my class, and they were like, yeah, we don't even know what anthropology is, lol. In practice, I think it's kind of like analyzing any topic that has something to do with humans or human societies and going in deep, like peeling back the layers of an infinite onion or something. I will not lie. Some of the anthropology literature is super dense and uses this annoying academic language like the imbrications of the epistemological praxis of the co-constitutive relational ontologies. And it's like, bruh, why don't you just say what you mean? Sometimes it just seems like they're using big words for the sake of using big words, which I find a little bit frustrating. And this ties into an issue we discussed frequently in class: accessibility. Who is this information for? A lot of anthropological research comes from the perspective of a supposed expert externally observing some community, which inherently risks being paternalistic and exploitative. And then when this scholarship gets siloed into the isolated ivory tower of academia, it often becomes inaccessible to the very communities it seeks to address. So yeah, it got pretty meta. We were critiquing the discipline of anthropology as elitist and out of touch, while sitting in an anthropology classroom of an institution that's elitist and out of touch. The cognitive dissonance is quite ouchy in the brain. Anyway, I wanted to try and democratize some of what I learned and share it with you all. Not in a I am trying to educate you kind of way, but more of a hey, here are some things that I found interesting or enlightening, and maybe you will too. The environmental justice movement, as a political and social phenomenon, has its origins in the 1980s among communities of color in the US. It was born in response to the unequal distribution of environmental harms along the lines of race, class, gender, age, and location. You might have heard of the term environmental racism, which calls attention to the fact that communities of color, especially low-income communities, disproportionately suffer from exposure to pollution, toxins, and other hazards, such as poor air and water quality, toxic waste dumping, and extreme weather events. They not only are much more likely to live in vulnerable areas, but often also lack the resources to recover. These conditions are not coincidental. They have roots in larger historical and structural forces. The sociologist Bunyan Bryant defines environmental racism as, quote, those institutional rules, regulations, and policies of government or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for least desirable land uses, resulting in the disproportionate exposure of toxic and hazardous waste on communities based on prescribed biological characteristics. Environmental racism is the unequal protection against toxic and hazardous waste exposure and the systematic exclusion of people of color from decisions affecting their communities, end quote. Basically, some communities are designated as disposable and are then deliberately targeted for harm or denied protection from it. We can see environmental racism manifesting today in the water crisis in Flint, or the pollution of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, or the dumping of electronic waste in Ghana. There are many definitions of environmental justice, but I find Bryant's to be pretty comprehensive. He defines it as, quote, those cultural norms and values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to to support sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence that the environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. Environmental justice is served when people can realize their highest potential. Then there's the question, what even is the environment? A common definition is where we live, work, and play. We often have this idea of the environment or nature as this pristine, untouched wilderness that is separate from us. But the boundary between humans and nature is very much a human construct, born out of the exceptionalism we grant ourselves as a species. We like to think of ourselves as special, as uniquely ordained to dominate this planet. But really, we are part of nature. The conceptualization of nature as separate from us, as outside of us, allows some people, especially the wealthy and powerful, to sustain a fantasy of being untouched by climate disaster. They can dump their waste in spaces deemed less valuable. They can hide behind walls and technology. They can turn their backs to the destruction of communities on the front lines. But as the seas rise higher, the fires burn brighter, the air grows thicker, escape becomes ever more an illusion. There is no outside. Also, this idea of nature as this unblemished landscape completely erases indigenous peoples and the fact that they've lived for centuries in sustainable, reciprocal, and integrated relationships with land. The entire premise of the conservation movement is that we need to protect nature from people. We need to preserve the natural beauty of the land because we otherwise would be actively destroying it. This is a very colonial way of relating to land because the underlying assumption is that by default, it's something to be conquered or exploited rather than respected and nurtured. And the practice of conservation necessarily requires the dispossession of indigenous communities, often through forced removal or the disruption of lifeways. Like national parks are hecka problematic. When we think about whose voices are being centered in the fight for environmental justice, here's another interesting point to consider. We often hear rhetoric around climate change as this impending doom. Like, oh my god, the planet is dying, and soon we'll all be dying. But this begs the question, apocalypse for whom? For some communities, the apocalypse has already been reality for centuries. Anthropologist Zoe Todd asks, quote, what does it mean to have a reciprocal discourse on catastrophic end times and apocalyptic environmental change in a place where, over the last 500 years, indigenous peoples face the end of the world with the violent incursion of colonial ideologies and actions, end quote. So, are we only recognizing disaster when it begins to tangibly affect the lifestyles of the elite or challenge the viability of capitalism as a political and economic system? Who are we leaving out from the mainstream discourse? This tension of erasure of certain voices also plays out in the hegemony of science and environmental discourse. Science is often touted as this objective and neutral process that uncovers absolute truth. But at the end of the day, it's one of multiple mechanisms for understanding the world. It's one of the best ways we've got, for sure, but it's still imperfect. Which questions are being asked, how they're being answered, and how those answers are used always leaves room for bias and subjectivity. According to the scholar Leah Temper, quote, "The development and application of scientific knowledge is inherently a political process that expresses and exercises power in the service of particular social, economic, or political ends." End quote. Examples of the dangers of scientific failure are abundant. Science once declared certain groups of people to be inherently inferior to others based on arbitrary physical characteristics. Eugenics was the thing. Don't get me wrong, this isn't to say we should distrust science, but rather we should recognize its limitations and its entanglement with the social and political contexts that produce and use it. When science is upheld as the only legitimate means of determining truth, the consequence is the devaluing of other forms of knowledge, like lived experience, local knowledge, and oral tradition, which are prevalent in many indigenous communities and have allowed them to thrive for millennia. Some communities might root their understanding of ecological phenomena in legends or narratives, rather than charts or statistics. These are just different, not inferior, ways of knowing. And they're probably far more relevant to the people themselves than some graph of methane emissions. When considering solutions to environmental catastrophe, some people advocate a kind of techno-utopianism. Basically, technology will fix everything. Rather than radically altering our ways of life and our political, social, and economic systems to be more sustainable, we can just innovate our way out of crisis. All we need is solar panels and carbon capture and asteroid mining. Well, not only is this incredibly unrealistic, technically speaking, but to me, it seems like quite the silly goosery to try and solve the pitfalls of capitalism with more capitalism. And this kind of thinking allows for complacency. Business as usual can go on for the privileged, while the people and planet around them are dying. The driver behind a lot of exploitation and environmental destruction is this capitalist ideal of infinite growth. We take it for granted that under normal conditions, our economies will continue to grow year after year. Growing the pie is an expression commonly used to justify economic growth as a means for improving the quality of life for everyone overall. Supposedly, everyone's slice of the pie increases in size as the pie itself grows. But you can't make a pie that's infinitely big, because eventually you'll run out of flour or sugar or whatever. Infinite growth is fundamentally impossible on a planet with finite resources. Why is limitless growth the goal in the first place? Why is prosperity measured by gross domestic product and not by equality or happiness or the thriving of our ecological systems? According to the scholar Greta Gard, Western civilization operates within a framework of dualisms, such as human-animal, culture-nature, civilized-primitive, reason-emotion, black-white, man-woman, heterosexual-queer, able-disabled, etc. These binaries were and are used to justify exploitation, violence, and conquest. In these pairs, there is a clear hierarchy. One element is dominant, while the other is devalued and subordinate. Often, these devalued terms become conceptually linked. For example, emotion is often considered to be feminine. Black people are sometimes compared to animals. queerness was once considered a mental disability. Or take the fact that we often think of nature as female. Like the whole Mother Nature concept might come from seeing nature as nurturing and life-giving. But maybe it also reflects the fact that we live in a culture that devalues nature and also devalues women. Okay, now I'm going to briefly explain the different elements of the painting and the decisions behind them. I titled the piece Anthropocene, which is a term that considers the era of significant human impact on the Earth's climate and environment as a distinct geological age. So there was the Jurassic, the age of the dinosaurs, the Carboniferous, the age of the amphibians, and now there's the Anthropocene, the age of humans fucking shit up. I like this concept because it collapses the false boundary between the history of humans and the history of Earth, which ties back to the whole notion of nature being a construct. That's also why I used a human form to represent nature, to emphasize the fact that we are nature, not distinct from or above it. The painting depicts a clash between Western civilization and non-Western ways of knowing and being. The destructive aspects of Western civilization I'm referring to include the dualisms I talked about earlier, the prioritizing of ownership and domination, and the exercise of violence and exploitation in pursuit of unhindered development, progress, and material accumulation. This contrasts with other ways of knowing and being, which emphasize interdependence and reciprocal relations, characterized by responsibility and respect between human and non-human beings. The bottom half of the painting is basically the Western civilization part. I made it darker, less saturated, and looser, like with the paint splattery things, to provide visual contrast with the top half, which is brighter, more vibrant, and more rendered. I also tried to show opposition in the direction of movement. The gray hand pulls down, while the green figure rises up and away. This hand is supposed to embody the human ambition to control and dominate nature, and also the confluence of capitalism, colonialism, exploitation, etc. I wanted to physicalize the greed in this claw situation going on here. The arm turning yellow is supposed to be like a dying plant because the green figure is literally being drained of its lifeblood. This is supposed to mirror the ecological degradation that comes with resource extraction. I also wanted to speak to the commodification of nature inherent to capitalism. Minerals and plants and animals and water become merely resources for growth and investment, rather than beings in their own right. Zoe Todd brings up the idea that oil, for example, isn't inherently bad. She says, quote, "It is not the oil itself that is harmful. Rather, the ways that they are weaponized through petro-capitalist extraction and production turn them into settler colonial industrial capitalist contaminants and pollutants," end quote. So what I was going for in my painting is that the stuff that is sustaining the life of this figure is co-opted and distorted into capitalist fodder. The pollution clouds represent literal pollution, but they also represent the concept of there being no outside that we can escape to. We breathe toxicity into our lungs. It enters our bloodstreams and penetrates our cell membranes. It literally becomes us. And the clouds also symbolize a more abstract pollution of our very beings. The traces of capitalism and colonialism and oppression continue to manifest in the ways we relate to ourselves, to others, to society. Also, the directionality of the clouds is supposed to be a positive slope, like stock market, GDP, the whole infinite growth thing. So all this stuff is a little dark, but ultimately I wanted the painting to retain some optimism. The gold leaf and rays of light represent hope. Some people might dismiss hope as naive and idealistic, but I really resonate with activist Mariam Kava's concept of hope as a discipline. She says, quote, "It's less about how you feel and more about the practice of making a decision every day that you're still going to put one foot in front of the other, that you're still going to get up in the morning. And you're still going to struggle. It's work to be hopeful, but it matters to have it, to believe that it's possible to change the world," end quote. I think hope is essential in the fight for justice. The enemy of any movement is indifference. Although our actions as individuals often seem futile and immaterial, every moment is another opportunity to push in the direction of justice. Rather than attempt to single-handedly save the world, Kaba suggests, quote, "Let's just do what we can, where we are, within our capacity, to the best of our abilities," end quote. With paintbrush in hand, I offer this small act of resistance.